All right, we're going to get started. So welcome to those of you who are watching this at home. Our scripture today is 1 Samuel 3, 1 through 21. And as before, we're just going to talk about any observations we had of the story, as well as where that leads us with the theme of the day of kind of being someone who listens to God and is a channel for God. So we have Samuel hearing the voice of God at night, and there's Eli tells him what to do, and then he gets a pretty hard message to share with Eli, who Eli accepts it. And Samuel grows up being actually a pretty awesome. I remember reading years ago, I did a read through the Bible program at church, and I remember Samuel being one of my favorite characters, that he was like the only non-disappointing person. Everyone else, no matter how great they were, did something that made you like groan. But he never really did. I really liked him. So. Yeah, they just didn't write it down. Or find out, yeah. Yeah, good guy. So any observations or... I took it one direction. You could take this a million different directions in terms of what the story signifies and means. I guess my first question would be, have you guys ever had anything in your life, whether it's a dream or even driving in your car, you hear a voice in your head or a gut feeling, something in your life that you're like, or as I mentioned, a person who seems to say something to you and you're like, okay, I'm being told something here.
I always want those, and I actually pray for those, and then I don't. I probably shouldn't say I don't get them. I don't recognize them because I probably do get them. But I can't think of a time where I've had that. And when my grandma died, I was very close to her, and she died a couple of years ago at 100. And I always wanted a dream to just see her, see her in heaven, or just kind of see her with Jesus, or just something comforting. And I've never had one. So I know God works in his ways, and I may have received signs other ways, but I'm not good at recognizing them.
I do think that is kind of a mystery when you want something, because I've heard other people say that they're like, just state plainly what you want, be very practical and say, I would like a dream, show up in my dreams. Yeah, and then it doesn't happen. That's frustrating. It may be that your grandmother's like, oh my gosh, Chrissy, I am showing up all the time doing this one thing. Pay attention, dropping coins. I don't know. That might be the thing is, how do you show up? How do you show up? Yeah.
Well, even here, even in this story, that's kind of what happened, where multiple times he's getting a direct sentence from God, and he's like, I don't know, he misinterprets it. Mm-hmm. And so I don't know how many times that happens to all of us, where something that, if seems to be clear is not clear to us. So we have to have someone help us decide what that means.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. There are so many voices coming at us constantly too, which is one of my struggles. How do you know that was God? Because it's just constant noise everywhere. You have people talking to you, media, what you read, what you hear, everything. It's just, you're inundated with noise. So how do you decipher which one was God or which ones?
And then there's also just your random thoughts and your random dreams. This happened in his sleep, and discerning what was just a random thought or a random urge of, oh my gosh, this political thing's going on right now, and I'm so fed up with what's going on, and I really should do whatever, write a book or whatever, and is that really God talking to you, or is that just your own inner voice? And then, of course, you wake up in the next morning and maybe you remember half of what was going on at the time, and you just get back into your routine and it fades.
Yeah, I think I've been thinking about that for a while. What's the litmus test of knowing that it was God's voice rather than anything else? And one of the things I've felt is if it's a little bit more gracious than I would give myself, it's probably from God. If it's more gracious towards others than I would do to myself, then it's probably from God. That usually God's desire is that you grow in love for others and yourself and a relationship with God. But then obviously you don't do everything well, and so sometimes you need a kick in the butt. But I don't think God gives us a kick in the butt the way people do. I think with God it's much more neutral and practical, like you need to stop because you're hurting yourself or you're hurting somebody else, instead of you're an awful human being, like how could you do this type of a thing, which is how we talk to ourselves and how we talk to others. So I remember hearing someone say that once, and they said the good advice from Spirit tends to be, even if it's quote bad news, is it's much more neutral in tone, just like, so you don't go into a shame spiral or a guilt spiral, which really doesn't bring out the best in you and good stuff. Although you could argue and say, hey, this was not neutral at all. This was really hardcore. But it may be in certain cases of like, he had a lot of power, his sons had a lot of power, what they were doing was deeply abusive. They were obviously ignoring other signs from God. So this was the kick in the butt Eli needed. I don't know. Yeah.
I could share one thing. I mean, the other day at Perkins, some guy gave me a book that a lady had written about what she felt was God's voice talking to her through several dreams. I forget the name of the gal. She grew up in Eastern Europe, so it's an unusual name for, from what I'm used to, Veluca or something like that. And supposedly the handwriting that is in the book and that was in her transcripts is supposedly different from her own handwriting. But so there are people who still say that they're hearing God's voice and they're writing this stuff down. But so they're doing kind of what you'd think that anyone who hears God's voice would want to do, but this is discerning who's legit versus who's making this stuff up.
Yeah, that's interesting. That's interesting. I mean, I don't think there's a single preacher. I hope there's not a single preacher out there who doesn't think they're trying to say something good. I don't know. It's really hard. It's really hard because people are in different places too. And so, yeah, no, that's a whole nother thing. Okay, no, I'll go there. I think that God gives us what we need as we need it. Because the full truth of everything is so big and so massive. You know, you don't give a 3-year-old a watermelon and ask them to carry that into the house. They're going to drop that sucker, you know. You don't teach a first grader, an average first grader, Algebra 2. Like, it's just too much. So God comes to us with what we need, giving us just the right challenge and the right push. And I do think that's one reason why there's so many different kinds of churches and faiths and denominations. I mean, I think we're doing some beautiful things here, but I do think there are some Christians who'd come here and just be extremely uncomfortable because it's not very black and white thinking, or just it has to be this way. That's what I'm comfortable with. And I think them going to a church that fits that may be what they need from God at that point. But I can't be in churches like that more than 5 seconds. That drives me nuts. And so we're kind of all in different places. And so that's, I think, the beauty of us saying, how can we all be faithful in our diversity? So God does come to us very differently in so many different ways. Yeah.
Is there any symbolism, do you think, to the idea of 3 times, where God came to him 3 times? It seems like that's repeated in other stories. Like Peter is asked if he believes or who Jesus is 3 times. I don't know. It seems like I could come up with more if I had more time, but I don't know if that's a symbolic thing or if they literally meant 3 times.
Wasn't it 4 times? I mean, the third time was when
Yeah, you're right about it is 3. It's 3 times that Samuel gets up. So they do things in 3, and that's super common in the Bible. You're absolutely right. It means this is for real. It's like that number of kind of completion, and so they're trying to get a point across by emphasis. So whatever the reality was, we don't know, but he goes to Eli 3 times before Eli gets it. And then, the 4th time is where he responds, but the 3 gets up 3 times to go to Eli. And that happens all over the Bible, things in triplicate. Mm-hmm.
Ben, are you asking if you think that happens in real life? Like we can trust something if we get it 3 times? That's the way I interpreted what you said.
I guess maybe to the question of, is this real or not? It seems like if it is real, in biblical stories, you're given, repetition to say, yeah, this is not something you're just imagining, like Jacob was saying, or just something you're just kind of thinking about. It is coming from God. So maybe that would be one way to discern, is if you're getting the same message over and over and over, and maybe from different people. It seems like that's kind of the serendipitous thing. If you're thinking about something and just happens that, this person talks to you about one thing, and then you hear the same conversation with somebody else, and then it just, maybe you're just attuned to it at that point.
Yeah, I think especially if you struggle with hearing the message once and realizing right away what it is, you'll get it more than one time. And that's the good news. I don't feel like you have one shot to do something. And even if you go the wrong way, I think you choose something that's not quite the way you should. God meets you then in that circumstance to try to, work with that, either work with that or self-correct, whatever it is, depending on how serious it is. So I've never liked the idea of there being one right path and one right this and one right that. And if you miss it, you've ruined everything. That just feels very scary. What's weird is years ago, this is 15 years ago, I read this book. It's kind of a weird book. I think I'd find it way less weird now. It was weird for me back then. Kind of angels, psychics, kind of stuff that was a little different. And I finished reading the book, and it was so different from my Lutheran upbringing. And I just prayed. I said, hey, if there's truth to what this book is saying, could you give me a sign? I kid you not. The next morning I drive to church, and I pass by a church, and there's a church sign, and it says, this is the sign you're looking for. And it happened so Yeah, it happens so quickly. And I even remember doubting that, going, well, that's just a coincidence. And can you imagine God going, are you kidding me? Could I have been more obvious? But I love that idea that it was a literal, like, how funny is that? And now in retrospect, I look back to it and I'm like, I've heard that thing that felt so weird. I've heard so many other people talk about similar things that now, yeah, I actually do think it's true, but it just felt really strange to me. So I did, yeah.
Kind of like those times. Oh, sorry. I was like, kind of like those times you turn on the radio and it happens to play just the song you kind of needed for what was going on at the time.
Yeah, I think actually that's really important, is to realize that you might say, oh, I have an impulse to put on this CD or two, if you're old enough and you still put on CDs, or turn on the radio, or you're flipping through social media and you see this article that grabs your attention, or you see the same article over and over and over again. You finally click on it and it either teaches you something that you really, really needed to know, or yeah, I do think that absolutely is one way that God works. There's just like, if we started a list of dreams to gut feelings to literal signs to somebody walking up to you and telling you exactly what you need to hear in that moment, to articles, to songs, to radio, to a news, whatever it is. Any way that gets our attention, I guess. I will say that for years ago, kind of towards the end of my marriage, I was praying a lot for it to be fixed. And every time I prayed, I heard silence. And in retrospect, there was nothing I would have listened to, because I was so bent on the fact that I can fix this. What was God going to tell me? If God would have said, no, you can't, I wouldn't have believed it. So I just got silence. And I remember being so irritated by that, feeling like, why aren't you telling me something? Why aren't you pointing me in the right direction? And God was just waiting for me to get to the point to go, oh, I can't do this anymore. Okay, now let's start talking. And then all of a sudden I felt like I had guidance. It was really, really interesting. So sometimes silence is actually one way God speaks to you, because you're not alone. Like, haven't been abandoned. You just can't. Yeah. I don't know how else to explain it, but it was interesting.
Makes me think of dealing with a child who's in the thralls of a tantrum, and the parent just picks the child up and takes the child to where the child needs to go until the child calms down enough to listen to what the parent's saying, and then the parent starts talking to the child. Up to that point, yeah, yep. You just can't. They're out of their mind. They're out of their mind. You can't say anything to them, so you just let them thrash and whatever. And if you need to get somewhere, you scoop them up, or you just let them throw themselves on the floor and do what they're going to do if that's the situation you're in.
And that actually brings me to a completely different direction that could have gone, is that Eli represents, in many ways, he's a priest. He's sort of the institutional church as it existed back then. He was the powers that be. It was a very small system. And he's not really really good at this. Like, he's probably good at all the nuts and bolts. He keeps the oil in the lamps. He keeps this clean. But if you remember earlier than this, Samuel's mother, Hannah, is really desperate for a child, and she feels awful. So she goes to pray. and she's crying and praying, and Eli just thinks she's drunk, and he's about ready to kick her out until she tells her story, and then he's like, oh, okay. And then here he raises Samuel, and he's got these two sons doing awful things, and then Samuel has no knowledge of God. It's just interesting. And Eli has his moments, he accepts this, but this idea that you can represent God's presence or God's church or be in that presence and completely miss it. And then Samuel comes in as the prophet to say truth to that power. And this is what happens with all the prophets. All the prophets come and they're almost always speaking to kings or priests, the people in power who should be good shepherds, should be knowing what's going on. So I think there's some really interesting metaphors there for like the fact that unfortunately sometimes the church gets it wrong, whether it's, you know, the everyday people or whether it's actually leadership. Yeah, and of course there's lots of examples of uncovering things about the Catholic Church and other things that have been very awful. And yeah.
And I find it interesting that it says that Samuel didn't know the Lord when it says here that he was even sleeping, lying down in the temple of the Lord where the ark of God was. I mean, I thought that where the ark was supposed to be the Holy of Holies, and I mean, only the chief priest was allowed in there. Or is this a different context from that?
No, I think you're right. I think that's probably was a developing concept. And I mean, this is written retrospectively. They actually use the word temple, but the temple wasn't built yet. So, you know, you just have discrepancies like that now and again that are going to happen. And but yeah, I think the truth is you can sleep right by what's supposedly the presence of God and not know God. You can work for God and not be able to listen to God. And I think that's true. You can professionally work for God, but be so busy with other noise things that you're not actually tuning in. And you can be overwhelmed with other things and actually miss tons of messages that God's trying to send you. So that's one reason that, at least ever since I've been a pastor, they really said, like, you have to take your days off and your vacation and take these boundaries training so that you can sense when you're starting to get off kilter. You sense your own red flags so that you know how to take your time off, so that you don't do or say something really stupid or go into an unhealthy place because you're trying to serve, right? You're trying to serve so hard. And I think this is true of a lot of caring professions in our country, whether it's social workers or nurses or doctors. I mean, there's tons and tons of caring professions that can not always often taught how to do self-care and encouraged to be in a really healthy place themselves so that they fill up your own cup, right? So that you can fill up other people's cup. Mm-hmm. I will say that my husband doesn't believe in like a lot of things, and he's very a skeptical person. So if you say something, he'll be like, but I'm the opposite. I'm like, that's probably true. Sweet. But a couple of years ago, I was sleeping. It was like the 2 a.m., 4 a.m. thing when I swear some person was at my bedside and just said, Siri. And I turned over and no one was there. And I was like, yes. And nothing happened again. And I was like, so my husband would say that was just a dream. But I don't know. I thought it was maybe someone trying to communicate with me and I was irritated that they didn't keep going. Yeah, I don't know. Well, what do you feel is personally the most interesting part of the story for you? Like what does this story mean to you today?
I'll go. I think we covered a lot of what it would speak to me about, just trying to have space to recognize God's voice, and I guess also the freedom to just ask for help when you need it. But also, I guess it's interesting in the context of so many other Old Testament stories, which I think this one sticks out as, one that's where God, I think, is nudging people to be good, I guess, and in the sense that it's not like the wrathful God, and it's like one of the instances in the Old Testament where it's kind of more merciful, where he's sending someone to help, and not sending an army, I guess. So this one always kind of stuck out for me in that sense.
So I think what this passage is telling me is the fact that like you said in the sermon, God's voice can come in a very small, faint whisper that it may not seem as obvious. Bless you, as the deep booming voice that we perceive it from the fiery bush, flaming bush before us and whatnot. That it can be subtle. And then I have to wonder too, maybe you can answer the question of, so what did transpire against the house of Eli later on? But we can, because I'm not recalling that part of the story, but we can get there after you get your chance.
Thank you. What stands out to me is the sentence, "Speak, Lord, for your servant is listening." So I guess what I take from this, is what I already said, how I struggle to always necessarily know which voice is the Lord's, but maybe I could be more open. Like maybe I need to say those words, not verbatim, but just in my life be a little more open to hearing. And I also think, like you were just saying that Siri said that he can speak in a small whisper, but I think he also speaks to me a lot through the very loud voices of my daughters. Like, there's an innocence there still in them, and there's like a sweetness that I tend to get very much in my head, and I worry a lot, and I plan, and I'm just very like analytical that way, and then, I'll come downstairs because I'm working from home, of course, and Emily will just be doing some sweet little innocent thing and just come up and give me a big hug, "Mommy," and it's like, that's what it's about. So they ground me, I think, kind of, and God speaks to me through them, I think, to remind me to stay humble and stay present and not be so in my mind trying to figure things out.
I think that's great because it's also messages are often simpler than we want them to be. Like one of the things that I've just heard over and over this fall is just like, Siri, lead with your heart, lead with your heart, lead with your heart. Just love the people at church, just love the people. And I'll have a situation come up and I'm like, oh, I don't know what to do about this. And it's like, if you led with your heart, what would you do? Okay, not what I was going to do. So, sometimes it's actually way simpler. It's just be here now. You're doing fine. I think we're pretty tough on ourselves too, because, life is tough at times. I'm not sure. I think if you looked in the Bible, you could probably see what transpired. But my guess, from what I remember, Eli and his sons just were not able to continue being priests. Their line didn't continue. Someone else took over rather than, because that was such a huge cultural concept of tribe and passing on an inheritance, whether it's literally money, but also roles. And since the priestly family, like it was families, to have that cut off was pretty serious. So yeah, I don't think they like died or anything. I think they literally just had the role taken from them. So yeah. But you can look that up and prove me wrong. Homework. Happy to have that checked out. Yeah. Well, anything else? Thanks for all your thoughts. And of course, anyone watching at home, feel free to share your thoughts if you ever wish to. That's always fun to know what people are thinking. So, all right, have a good day.